we're all a little behind time today, but the Walker Art Gallery has started doing some really important works looking at the legacies of slavery within its collections. I think we're always a bit late to do this kind of work, but it's something that we're really trying to move forward with now. So we have been working from the University College London's Legacies of Slavery database, and we did an audit on our fine art collections to see what kind of links there were to art and slavery in our collections. We found a really problematic area in the sculpture gallery to do with the Liverpool Sandbach family, and so that's when we launched the Legacies of the Liverpool Sandbach family project. And this project was funded by the Understanding British Portraits Network, and part of the project, the most important part of the project, was to look, do a kind of sector review of decolonising practices to sort of see the different ideas and things that people were doing, but it was also, the main part of the project again was to work with Liverpool's young marginalised communities. And so we brought together a steering group of 7 young people and a facilitator, and we sort of devised a sort of, I don't know what it is, like a session, 6 sessions where we could embark on learning about the Liverpool Sandbach family and the kind of connections they had to slavery, but then also, so we did 3 sections that was devoted to learning about the Sandbach family, and that was we did like an introductory section, so we talked about the research that we've been doing. We went to ISM and the archives and did very, very similar talks to what you guys have done today. And we also did a wonderful talk that Malik Al Nasir gave for the group, and he talked about his research into his roots and his own family history. And Malik's going to talk about that in a minute, so I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. But the next 3 sessions were where we sort of discussed ideas with the group, thought about things that we could do with the sculptures, whether they should be removed from display or whether we should, how can we reinterpret these sculptures and start talking about these histories with our audiences. And we actually realised that some of the most important part of the discussions was what was happening in the room with the group. So we put together a podcast which was actually recorded by one of the steering group members. And that's on the website. You can all find this on the Walker's website, so do have a look, and the displays in the sculpture gallery downstairs. But we also made some changes to the physical display as well. So I should also say Malik's talk is on the website as well. So we also made some physical displays in the gallery. The group decided to move an object from ISM, ankle shackles from ISM, that were on display at the International Slavery Museum, and put them beside the sculptures. And we did this in a very, we thought about it in a lot of detail. We spoke to the curators at ISM and sort of thought about how we would do this, and I think it works quite nicely in the display, and I do encourage people to go and have a look at it. And we also obviously did new interpretation to discuss the Sandbach family, which Malik will go into in a minute, and we also displayed some other objects. So we had objects connected to sugar and tobacco, and a ledger that was found in the archives at the Maritime, which was connected to a Sandbach plantation in Grenada. So it's just been a really interesting project, and I have to say the group are the main part of that project. They just really pushed the boundaries and made us think differently about our collections. And yeah, so that's kind of what we've been doing at the Walker, and I was hoping when you guys are going to come that our Legacies of Slavery website would have been live. We've got 55 works, that we've identified, we've reinterpreted, and will be going online very shortly, but as usual it's taken a little bit more time than we planned. But that's the kind of work we've been starting to do at the Walker, and we have bigger and bolder projects in mind as well. So I would like to introduce Malik, who has been researching his family history for many years and is doing a PhD at Cambridge, and I won't go into too much more detail because I think he's going to be able to tell you a lot more. Yeah.
how much I have to project my voice to be heard. Can people hear me at the back? Okay, great. I'm standing at the podium not because I'm delivering a presentation on a laptop, this is not mine, it's because I put my water here. So thank you Alex, Frankie and Laura, CSIS, National Museums and Galleries Liverpool, which includes of course the Walker Art Gallery, for agreeing to have me here today and to discuss with you the significance of being able to reinterpret not only the contents of archives, but actually the whole concept of archiving itself. As you may have noticed coming in, there's a display here of archival materials. What is perhaps a little bit unusual about this archive and display is it's mine. It belongs to me. It was purchased privately using a credit card, at great expense, for a particular reason. And that reason was when I attempted to understand my own historical legacy and my own cultural identity and my own roots through slavery and colonialism, I was faced with one single massive brick wall: accessibility to the information in the archives. The decisions of what to exhibit, the decisions of what to curate, the decisions of what to acquire, what to index and what to catalogue were being made by people who didn't look like me. And many of those people will have had their own interpretations of what they thought about the British Empire, colonialism and slavery. And those decisions being made arbitrarily by those individuals had meant two things to me. One was that much of what I'd been looking for wasn't on display. What it also meant to me was that when I did find something of potential interest to me in terms of understanding my own historical roots through slavery and colonialism, in my particular case through Demerara in what was then British Guyana, I was faced with the times that the library was open, whether or not the person on the other side of the counter, the archivist, really understood what I was looking for, whether I actually knew what I was looking for, because much of it wasn't indexed or catalogued, even though it may have been there. And then how long I was allowed to look at it. I was unable to photocopy the documents because the folios were old, and the heat of the photocopier, etc., would have been an issue. I was unable to photograph the documents, and I'm not a paleographer. Some of these handwriting is akin to a doctor's prescription from the 1970s. It's very difficult to read this stuff. And you're in dim-lit libraries with tiny scrawled handwriting on delicate documents that you can't photograph, that you can't properly handle, and that you can't blow up with anything other than one of those great big things what my grandma would use to try and, when she was half blind. I don't have a half blind grandma, I'm just saying it's horrible. So, how are you supposed to do the research when someone passes you a box, even if that box is relevant and everything in it is what you need, but you've got 2 hours before we close, you can't photocopy anything, you can't blow anything up, it's scrawled in this little handwriting. It is really debilitating as a researcher to go into that environment to try and extrapolate the salient points that you need in order to be able to understand what's in those documents. So then we move on to the modern age. I started my research into my family history in 2002. Since then, there have been a lot of developments in terms of the digitisation and transcription. But again, the data sets that are produced by that process are very much at the discretion of the curators, academics in some cases, librarians in other cases, archivists. They're the ones who decide what's going to get digitised as a priority. We've got whole stacks of stuff what do we consider to be the priorities? The papers of Winston Churchill, the racist Prime Minister, may well be a priority, but the papers of slavery and colonialism and the sort of atrocities thereof might not. And someone in the middle is making that decision, and that someone doesn't look like someone like me. So what I wanted to do was to still find out who I am. I live in a society where since I was a child I was told to go back to where you came from without really knowing where that was. I was constantly being told that I don't belong here, but I belong somewhere else, not knowing where that was either. And my sense of identity had been coloured by the racism and the prejudice that was inherent within the society in which I was born and raised. So consequently, I was left with this dilemma of trying to really ascertain my historical roots, but without having access to the documentary evidence. How was I supposed to do that? So we rely in the black community on oral histories, and we rely on our elders to be able to tell us stories. But some of these stories can be quite fantastical, some of them are spattered with mistruths or half-truths, and some of them have the exact nuggets of information that you need, but don't have the documentary evidence available to back them up. So it becomes imperative for us to be able to find another way to traverse this. I was determined to know who I am, where I come from, what my history was, and I wasn't going to be deterred by the inaccessibility of the information in the archives. So my research started in 2002 with a documentary from BBC Scotland on 100 years of black footballers. And during their research into that documentary from Arthur Wharton, who played for Preston North End at the turn of the 20th century, to your Justin Fashion News, your John Barnes, who were there in the sort of the 80s and the 90s. But while they were doing their research, BBC Scotland uncovered a character in the Scottish football annuals who captained the Scottish national side in the 1880s called Andrew Watson. And the thing about Andrew Watson was, having made a documentary about him themselves, which they showed after the 100 years of black footballers, just one specifically on him, he looked just like me. He was from Demerara, like my father, and he had the same family name, Watson. I changed my name to Malik Al Nasir when I became a Muslim in 1992. Prior to that, I was Mark Watson. My father was Reginald Wilcox Watson, my grandfather was George Edward Watson. All from Guyana, what is present-day British Guyana. Well, present-day Guyana, formerly British Guyana. So, tracking this history back became really, really difficult. There was an ageing Guyanese community in Liverpool who were able to tell me some snippets of things, like, your father told me that he lived in Weldad, a Dutch-named village on the way to the east. So I had one little snippet of information. I was able to go to the National Archives, and they sent me my father's wartime record, because someone had told me that he'd served in the military in 1942. I'd known him as a merchant seaman, not as a Royal Navy seaman, but the National Archives came back, they had his ration book, and they had a copy of his military service. Later on, I acquired his discharge book, and sure enough, the military service was in there. So I got that from the National Archives, but not much more. But it did give me the name of my grandmother, Olivia July, in Meadowbank, in East Bank, Demerara. And from that, I set upon a search to see if I was related to Andrew Watson. That search has continued to this day. And what you'll see here in this archive are folios and other ephemera relating to the family that Andrew Watson was derived from. So his father was Peter Miller Watson, a Scottish sugar merchant who had been sent out as a young man in his early 20s by his family to Demerara to look after their slave plantations and holdings, which were numerous. His mother, Christian Robertson, his grandmother, Christian Robertson, was one of the three daughters of a priest at the Manse of Kilturn in Scotland, and they were known as the Three Fair Maids of Kilturn. Andrew's father not only ran the slavery plantations right up until 1833, and then through the period of apprenticeship until 1838, and then thereafter up until the 1850s, using indentured labourers. And he wrote many letters back to the headquarters of their operation in Liverpool, known as the Sandbach Tinny Company. They also had an operation in Glasgow, which built their slave ships. Later they're what they call coolie ships, which is a derogatory term as well, I might add. And they also provided the insurance to underwrite their cargoes. So there was a tripartite arrangement between them, between Demerara, Glasgow and Liverpool. So the firm Sandbach Tinny had many iterations. It was the Sandbach family that Alex alluded to before, which we have some material culture here from the Sandbach family. There are some marble reliefs downstairs of members of the Sandbach family, Henry Robertson Sandbach, and a couple of others, I think his wife, Margaret Sandbach, who incidentally was the granddaughter of William Roscoe, the famous abolitionist, but she married one of the biggest slave trading families in Britain at that time and enjoyed the benefits of the Hafodunus estate in Denbighshire, which was their stately home where she lived out many of her years, and became a thespian and provided much financial support to the sculptor John Gibson, who carved those marbles that you see downstairs. But the Sandbach family had slipped from, the prominence that they enjoyed during the height of the British Empire to relative obscurity until I conducted this research. There were people in Liverpool like Lawrence Westcott, Ray Costello and others who were helpful when I started the research. It was Lawrence that brought it to my attention that these guys had a bank. I then went on to find out that that was the Bank of Liverpool and did extensive research into the establishment of that bank, which went on to become Bank of Liverpool Martins Bank Limited. Any of you who've been to the town hall, you'll see the massive building next to it, which dwarfs it across exchange flags. That was the Bank of Liverpool Martins Bank headquarters, and when they were subsumed in 1969 into Barclays Bank, it constituted about 40% of Barclays' global portfolio at that time. So there's a direct chain of liability between these slave plantations in Demerara funding the establishment of the Bank of Liverpool, which was first on Water Street opposite. Lawrence, what was the name of the hotel? Talbot Hotel. So the Talbot Hotel on the corner of Water Street and Castle Street, where all the slave merchants used to meet and all the captains used to meet, was purchased in 1831 by Samuel Sandbach, namesake of the firm Sandbach Tinny, and many other of his contemporaries. There was a group of shareholders led by William Brown of William Brown Street, which is obviously where all this stuff sits. William Brown was the first chairman of it. It was almost entirely slave money that was used to establish the bank in 1831. It then dwarfed, the building that it was in, the former Talbot Hotel building, and then they knocked down 3 buildings next to the town hall on Water Street and built the Martins Bank building there. And you'll see that building there to this day with the little carvings of the slave boys standing back to back with the money bags in their hands and King Neptune over the top of it representing the sea, because Sandbach Tinny also owned a shipping line as well. So there's a stack of material relating to the Sandbach Tinny enterprise here in Liverpool across all of the NML entities. So of course, Sudley House displayed Mrs. Tinny's wardrobe, one of the best collections of Art Deco clothing that is available anyway, by someone who, was the Paris Hilton of the day, who would walk into Owen Owens and, they'd shut the shop for her because she'd just buy up everything and she'd bring her ladies with her. And half of this stuff was never even worn. But there was no mention when Mrs. Tinny's wardrobe went up that she was a direct descendant of Philip Frederick Tinny, namesake of the Sandbach Tinny enterprise, the father of John Abram Tinny, who was the second largest recipient of slavery compensation after John Gladstone in 1833. So the contextualization of these archival materials, whether they're in, clothing archive as we had in Sunday House, or the reliefs that are here in the Walker Art Gallery, or the folios that you'll find called Parker Papers. Charles Stewart Parker was one of the partners in this family, and also a family member at the William Brown Street Library, or any of the paintings that they have of Sandbach's tinny ships at the Maritime Museum. All of these things, for one reason or another, have never been contextualized up until recently in relation to enslavement or colonialism. These are seen to be, the great historical relics of our society, but never put into context. This is why the work that Alex did with the Sandbach steering group was so important, because it gave us the opportunity to recontextualize this material. To say, yes, John Gibson was a great sculptor, yes, he was patronised by Margaret Sandbach, yes, these marbles are wonderful and they're part of this history, but let's put a set of slave shackles from the Middle Passage next to them, because that's how it was financed. And you can't understand these material objects in context without understanding where they came from, how they were financed, and the nature of the people. And you'll see from one of the reliefs, Alex, what's the name of that relief, the one, "Come unto me, the children of..."
Christ blessing the children.
Christ blessing the children. So you have in the centre, Jesus blessing the children, and on the right you have John Gibson the sculptor, and on the left you have Henry Robertson Sandbach, writing themselves into the history with Jesus, and he's a slave trader. Do you see what I mean? When I went out to the Hafodunus estate in Wales, I found in the first floor there are ceramic tiles all the way around the mansion house with the Psalms. These are some of the most vicious, evil people that ever walked the face of this earth, doing some of the most brutal and callous things that you could possibly imagine, and things that you could not imagine to other human beings. But yet they're being portrayed in the historic, material culture as these stalwarts of, our historical preeminence. William Brown Street with the museum, William Brown Street Library, All of these street names that Lawrence and others have documented in terms of the slave traders ingratiating themselves, the Colston statue. We have all of these images and these narratives behind these images which are designed to make us think of these people in a context other than their reality. So how do we establish that reality? We have to go back to the source material, which brings us back to the archives. If we can't get into the archives, if the people who are in the archives won't curate the things that we need to see, if they will not index and catalogue the things within their stacks, if they will not digitize and transcribe the things that even are indexed and catalogued and make them available and accessible to us, how are we supposed to be able to understand our history as black people when black history, we were forbidden to read and write during 400 years? If we couldn't read and write, all history is all we had. So when I went back to Guyana to find my history, I had one snippet of information from an old Guyanese seaman in Liverpool. They used to call him Sourpot. Everyone in Guyana's got nicknames, okay? So this guy was called Sourpot because he used to get the fruit and veg when it was kind of going off, and he used to still use it. So he's known as Sourpot. And Sandbach told me, long after my father had died, that your father told me he lived in Weldad, this Dutch village. So I went to Guyana, and I went to Weldad, looking for Watsons. I couldn't find any Watsons in Weldad. But somebody else told me that there was an old man in the village who was probably 103 years old, and he knew some stuff that other people wouldn't know. So I went and I found this guy, and he was still very lucid. I was able to extrapolate from him that they had no school in Weldad, because my grandfather was a schoolmaster, George Edward Watson, but there was a school in the Scottish-named village next door called Belladrum, and that they used to send a team to play cricket in Weldad, and they used to have a guy there they used to call Teacher Watson. So I was able to, from that, validate what Sandbach had told me that my father had told him before I was born, and that he had remembered, and he was able to give me that one snippet of information which started me on my journey when I reached Guyana. And as a result of that, he passed me on to another guy who did family history in the village. He also didn't know anything about Watsons, but he did take my number and said, if I find anything, I'll let you know. The following day, he's in a bank, and overheard two old ladies having a conversation, where one of them said, and what's your name? And she said, my name's Braybank, it's a Dutch name. And she said, is that your maiden name? She said, no, my maiden name is Watson. So he perked up and went straight over to her and said, there's this English guy, and he's over here in Berbice, he's looking for Watsons, can I give him the details? And she said, yeah. That 84-year-old woman turned out to be my first cousin. Her father and my father were brothers, and she had lived with my father in a place called Kitty, just outside Georgetown. My father left in 1936, I think it was in the early 1930s. She was 8 years old at the time. So she had a fading memory and not much information, but she was able to give me enough. But what she also was living on plantation land passed down from my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was a schoolmaster. Where did he get acres and acres and acres of plantation land? Of which my father should have had a share. But my grandfather's wife gave my father's share to her son and that, so we didn't get that. Who I found when I travelled to London. And unfortunately, he didn't want to give me too much detail because he thought I'd come to take the land. So again, I'm dealing here with oral histories and the significance of these oral histories to tell me things that I cannot find in the archives. Okay? But I'm documenting all of this meticulously as I'm going on. I'm still in the archives in the Walter Rodney archives in Demerara, trying to find out from the who's who of Guyana, various different characters and so on. I'm doing little family trees by hand of anyone who knows anything about Watsons or Julys in Demerara. And then I'm coming back here to the archives to try and find out some more information. So what I did find from the Parker papers at the William Brown Street Library was some reference to Andrew Watson's father, Peter Miller Watson. So when I got out to Demerara, I was able to ascertain from the voter registration there how many, how many properties he owned or he disclosed as his qualification to vote. So at that time, you had to be white to vote, you had to be wealthy to vote, you had to be male to vote. So your qualification was you had X number of acres under cultivation, or you had property with a value of Y, or you had an income of Z. If you didn't have those things, you weren't eligible to vote. Peter Miller Watson was eligible to vote based on his ownership of Plantation Le Bon Intention, which anyone who knows Guyana knows that that's a village in Guyana now, and a third of Plantation Zeebrugge. So I was able to bring that information back and start searching a bit wider. And I found some of these stamp dealers, philatelists, who collect ephemera purely for either the stamp or the postmark. They're not interested in the contents of the letters. They're only interested in whether the postmark is rare. A rare postmark can be incredibly valuable. And Guyana is a particular place of interest because, in case you don't know, the rarest stamp in the world is the British Guyana, 1 cent magenta. Okay? It comes up on Christie's or Sotheby's once in a blue moon and it sells for millions. It turns out that Sandbach's Tinny minted that stamp. And their ship, the Sandbach, the flagship of their fleet, is the ship on the stamp. And the ship on all the subsequent stamps for about the next 30, 40 years until they eventually put the monarch on the stamp. So then you've got the Sandbach's Tinny ship on the top left and the monarch in the bottom right. And then the ship disappears and it's just the monarch. So this gives you some idea of the power and the influence of these people at that time. So having ascertained that Sandbach's Tinny was this entity, that these stamp dealers occasionally had 1 or 2 letters relating to them, I decided it was time to acquire them. So I acquired about a dozen of these letters. At this time, I did not know that these people were interrelated. I thought they were just a business relationship. But simultaneously, I produced a family tree. And as I'm producing the family tree, I'm starting to see this is an incestuous family. They're all intermarrying each other. Two brothers will marry two sisters, and two business partners will marry two sisters. Their children will marry each other. This is the kind of nature of it because there was a phenomenal amount of wealth changing hands between this group. Think about it. They own plantations, they own thousands of slaves, they own properties, they own railway shares, they own shipping lines, they own insurance companies, they own their own bank. And they had parliamentarians. John Gladstone MP, the architect, if you like, of the slavery compensation scheme, and chair of the West India Company, is in this family. His son, William Ewart Gladstone, the longest serving Prime Minister in British history, is in this family. Okay? The Scottish lineage of his family traces back to Robert Bruce. In fact, he named them Robertson after himself. So Andrew Watson, the footballer, his grandmother, Christian Robertson, is of the clan Robertson, who were called Robertson by Robert the Bruce after Bannockburn. So the relevance of this history has ramifications right across the board, whether it's Scottish history, philatelic history, archival research history, slavery history, stuff to do with industrialisation and mass transit. These guys were among the first investors in the railroads. They paid for the survey for the Liverpool-Manchester rail line that Stephenson's rocket went on. Philip Frederick Tinney paid for that survey. Okay? They came to Liverpool and established not only civic institutions, one of them, Thomas Stuart Trail, established the Royal Institute on Colquitt Street. They were founder proprietors of the Athenaeum. You'll find Samuel Sandbach there, Philip Frederick Tinney, John Abram Tinney, J. Ernst Tinney. J. Ernst Tinney as well was the treasurer for 40 years of the Blue Coat, indenturing children here in Liverpool to clerk or provide housemaid services to the elite. They established the community, or were instrumental in establishing the community in Everton around St George's Church, where many of the family are buried, when that was essentially a gated community. The only reason I think they moved out was after the potato famine, that became a refugee camp for Irish migrants, and then all the merchants kind of moved out and came to Egbert. But prior to that, that was a kind of gated community. And if you go to the church, it's St George's Church in Everton, isn't it, Lawrence? Yeah. If you go to St George's Church in Everton, you'll see all the gravestones there, including that of Samuel Sandbach, who went on to be Mayor of Liverpool between 1830 and 1831. So, where did I get all this history from? I got all this history from studying my own ancestry through a combination of oral histories and by going to these philatelists and purchasing these archival documents for myself, because I could not get access to the archival documents that I needed within the archives. And then through that, I managed to find a bigger deposit of folios, over 100 folios, which came up as a job lot. And it came up as a job lot for one reason and one reason alone. The postmarks were not rare or uncommon. So they bagged them all together and just went, boom, one job lot. So I purchased it. And this has turned out to be a very significant find. So as a consequence of my research now at Cambridge University, I got Cambridge Library, University Library, to agree, along with my, I'm funded by the ESRC scholarship, and they put some money in as well, to digitise this entire collection. It's in the process of being transcribed at the moment, and will soon sit as a collection on Cambridge Digital Library alongside Charles Darwin's diaries and Isaac Newton's papers and so on. What's the point I'm making? The point I'm making is that we need to be able to interject our histories into their spaces. And in order to do that, we need to train the archivists. We need to train the curators. We need to train the people who would be regarded as digitising, cataloguing, indexing these collections. The people who are actually going out and purchasing these collections. And we need to prioritise them. Our history is lost to us in your archives. It's only going to come out if you give us the opportunity to look at them. Because you may not look at them in the way we look at them. Because your history is very well documented. It's meticulously documented. Just the difference between a person born in 1780 in England, you'll have the birth record, you'll have the death record, you'll have the baptismal record, you'll have banns and marriages. But a slave born at the same time, you'd be lucky if you have a first name in the slave register with a sort of age about whatever. They treated it no different than if a horse had been born. It wasn't that they didn't have the mechanism to be able to document these things meticulously, or the technology or the understanding of why it was important. They did. But there was a deliberate attempt to obscure it so that we would not know our history, because without our roots we have no firm foundation to move forward. And in order to decolonise the archives, and truly decolonise the archives, we need to first train black people to be able to go in to these spaces and perform meaningful roles and functions at every single stage, from the moment the decision's taken as to what we collect, right up to the final display. So I was quite pleased that National Museums and Galleries Liverpool agreed to partner with me on a number of projects, and also invited me to be a part of the project that Alex initiated, which was an opportunity to really take just one small aspect of the influence of the Sandbach family, triggered by my research, but also to be able to then look into ways to educate young people about the seriousness, the relevance and the importance of this material culture, and how it should be documented, and how it should be displayed, and how it should be contextualized properly and appropriately. And then to see Alex and the team take it to such an extent where we now have an exhibit here downstairs of the Sandbach marbles with the slave shackles next to them, and a context which is being derived from the narrative primarily derived by the kids themselves, wasn't it? Yeah, the children actually made the determination. And the beauty of the programme, the way Alex did it, was she gave them the opportunity to really decide how they wanted to look at the material objects in the culture, and how they wanted to contextualise it, and how they saw that it should be displayed. So it was a ground-up approach rather than a top-down approach. And it's resulted in something which is incredibly engaging, and these are just a handful of objects. The same thing has to some degree been done with Mrs. Tinney's wardrobe, but I think that's still a work in progress. And there's plans afoot now, working with myself, National Library of Scotland, William Brown Street Library, Glasgow University, Scottish Business Archives, Cambridge University and Bristol University to pull together a consortium of institutions to produce an exhibit that will tell the story of the British Empire through the lens of one family, the Sandbach Tinney family. And that story will involve also the development and training of a variety of people throughout the process in each of those different locations at all levels. So from the community level right through to postdoctoral research levels. And we're still at the early stages of that, so there'll be more information about that to come. But that has all been born out of the fact that I was, A, as a child, made to feel unwelcome and told to go back to where I came from, where I didn't know where it was. And B, the inaccessibility of the archives, which has forced me to go out and buy my own archives in order to be able to tell that history. But the final outcome is that I'm now bringing that history back after it's been on the BBC and it's been in the Times. And, you know, it's gone out into the public domain. The recognition of the significance of this history is now established enough for these institutions to take me seriously. And that is the only reason that I've been able to get a scholarship to go to Cambridge. That's the only reason I was able to get into Cambridge as it was. I walked around with this archive in my hands and knocked on many doors, only to be told, lovely, but no thanks, because there was no impetus for it. Until George Floyd, bless him. And that changed everything with Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives have always mattered. But I think in this case it mattered because white people said Black Lives Matter. When black people said Black Lives Matter, no one really took a great deal of notice. So that's without wishing to be disingenuous, but just a statement of fact as a black person whose life for many years was considered not a matter at all. Thank you.